The entire agri-food sector bears the brunt of the climate crisis.
Pour parler d'agriculture et d'Europe à la jeunesse.
Proteste der Landwirte zeigen, wie wichtig der strategische Dialog ist.
La PAC, c'est plus du tiers du budget total de l'Union européenne.
We have to find a new consensus on the future of agriculture.
The environmental focus of the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy is to make our farming more sustainable and less polluting. The Green Deal, launched by the European Commission 5 years ago, is the EU's flagship initiative to accelerate and deliver this transition. In the recent European election campaign, the Green Deal came under considerable scrutiny, not least from farmers and farming organisations. But overall, the outcome of the election has given fresh impetus to the mainstream political forces that have driven the Green Deal forward over the past 5 years. Nevertheless, the election campaign across Europe highlighted the tension that sometimes exists between farming and the environment. In this 44th edition of Food for Europe, we look at this question once again in the wake of Europe's unique democratic exercise. We'll be hearing from Wolfgang Burtscher, the Director-General of the European Commission's Directorate-General for Agriculture and Rural Development, DG Agri, and from Clara Bourgin, from Friends of the Earth, an environmental advocacy group. But first, if you've listened to our previous 43 episodes of this series, you'll know that we like to transport you somewhere among Europe's unique wealth of rural landscapes. For this episode, we're taking you to Italy, to the region of Emilia-Romagna.
My name is Matteo Pagliarani. I'm 29 years old and I come from Mercato Saraceno in the province of Forlì-Cesena. My company is called Chlorofilla. It's an agricultural company with various elements. We don't have a farming background. My dad was a first-generation farmer. But now, with the whole family, we try to take forward our shared objectives, namely looking after the land and production. About 20 people work for Chlorofilla. It's a structured operation. We raise goats, we have some sheep, and some Romagnola cows, which is a local breed. We have about 40 head of cattle. We produce chickens and chicks for fattening, and we even have a restaurant for visitors, which is completely organic, and which we try to make a reflection of our values on the farm. So if you come to eat here, you'll discover who we are.
It seems wherever Food for Europe takes you on this continent, the challenges facing farmers are much the same.
We're in what can be called a disadvantaged area because we're caught between development and nature. Nature which is not at all easy to live with. And it's not easy either here to raise a family because the fundamentals like schools and hospitals are ever further away and public service provision is increasingly scarce. Most of all, we're in an area where climate change is causing serious problems. And as we've seen in recent years, we're nothing compared to the power of nature.
Despite the challenges that Matteo has told us about, there's clearly an upside to the job, if indeed we can call it a job.
Well, I could say that the evolution of this job fascinates me precisely because it's not a job. It's a whole world that opens doors to other worlds. And over the years, it's enabled me to meet people, to gain as much knowledge as I can, to make my voice heard, and above all, to learn about different types of farming. It adds up to a variety of work, which is very, very interesting. I'm exceptionally keen on working with animals, and also, in our case here, the tourism sector.
We featured the situation facing young farmers a couple of times in Food for Europe episodes. For example, have a listen to episode 43 on European Youth Week that we broadcast in April, or episode 31 a year ago, featuring young Austrian farmers Johannes and Christina. So, is anything different for Matteo?
I would say that the situation of young farmers around here is a reflection of the broader situation across Europe, in which roughly 6.5% of farmers are under the age of 35. This means that young farmers are facing challenges for various reasons, but I would say the most important reason, which is certainly the case here in this region, is inadequate income.
You heard Matteo talking a moment ago about how farming has given him a platform to make his voice heard. Specifically, Matteo has dived into the world of advocacy and representation at European level, championing the hopes, aspirations and expectations of those in a similar position to him.
Since June 2023, I have been Vice President of the European Council of Young Farmers, an association which brings together 33 associations in 22 member states and around 2 million young farmers across Europe. There's nothing more important in shaping agricultural policies than the European context. Because quite simply, 1/3 of the European budget is earmarked for agriculture, and we increasingly need it to be dedicated to young farmers in the coming years.
We met Matteo just a day after the final voting day of the European election, a campaign that was undoubtedly influenced by the vocal dissatisfaction expressed by some farmers and farmers' groups across Europe. We asked Matteo to reflect a little on how he saw the electoral campaign as a farmer.
It's clear that these European elections have in recent months focused attention on the environmental elements of the common agricultural policy. Often these environmental considerations take a theoretical approach instead of a practical approach to farming. From my perspective, this policy needs to be structured, because it's difficult asking farmers to make changes without a medium to long-term perspective.
Thanks to Matteo Pagliarani. And we'll be back in Emilia-Romagna towards the end of the episode as Matteo helps us look to the future of Europe and the future of farming in Europe. Now let's hear from Wolfgang Burtscher, who's Director-General of the European Commission's DG Agri. First of all, what strikes you about what you've just heard?
I have very carefully listened to the remarks of our young farmer Matteo from Italy. And firstly, Europe needs food security. And we have often reflected what are the drivers for food security. And one tends to forget that a key element for food security is that you have farmers, and preferably also young farmers. You need generational renewal if you want to have mid- and long-term food autonomy. And I say this because the average age of farmers in Europe today is 57 years. So I think everybody will agree that we have to do our utmost to attract young people to the profession of farmers. But why does this not occur? Why have we lost 3 million farmers in 10 years? Why do these people leave the sector?
Well, Matteo was suggesting there that it boils down largely to financial issues. Farmers just aren't making enough money to survive, let alone thrive.
Farmers' income is still an important issue. We have seen it in the farmers' protests. If you want to be a young person to found a family, you also need economic security. Now, I think we need and will have still a discussion to what extent public support is necessary for the economic survival of farmers. But evidently, there are certainly other elements. Many young farmers argue that it is almost impossible today to buy agricultural land. The because agricultural real estate is becoming hugely expensive. That they do not get credits from banks because banks consider that agriculture is not necessarily a sustainable activity and they have to spend money only on sustainable activities. So I think there are many impediments that make agriculture less attractive for people, on which we have to work in the future.
And how do you see agriculture evolving for the generation of farmers that Matteo is part of, that he represents?
I think what Matteo has told us, the farmer, the profession of the farmer becomes increasingly multifunctional. Because many farmers are not only producing anymore their food, but they are also promoting the products that they are producing. They need to take care of environment, biodiversity, and climate. And they need to become specialists in digitalization. So the notion of a farmer today and tomorrow will be very different from what we know from our parents.
Beyond the financial issues and the changes to farming that you've highlighted here, to what extent do you think there are also reputational issues that deter young people from taking up farming?
Why do you want to become a farmer if out there, and I say this very deliberately, many people think that farmers are destroying the environment and are the evil in terms of climate change? So I really appeal to those who are criticizing agriculture and common agricultural policy to be holistic in their criticism. There are production models and farmers who probably do not work in a sustainable manner. But there are many others who do a great job in protecting environment and biodiversity. And those of us who think that if you leave areas, landscapes uncultivated, that the paradise will be back again on that land, they should look at some of this land, what is happening there, and whether there is the biodiversity and the richness they would expect. It is not the case. So I think if you want to have more young farmers, also appreciate that many farmers do a good job, which will increase the attractiveness of the job.
Wolfgang Burtscher, Director-General of DG Agri, thanks for joining us on Food for Europe.
Thank you for the opportunity to have this exchange.
And now, to look at this topic from a slightly different perspective, we have Clara Bourgin from Friends of the Earth. Clara, welcome.
Thanks a lot for inviting me to be part of this podcast.
I started this podcast by talking about the political renewal that has taken place in the shape of the European election. What do you think the results demonstrate for agriculture and the environment?
What the EU election results show is that European citizens need to see more concretely the benefits that a green transition could bring to them, and that the need to address the climate and biodiversity crisis is not going away and is only becoming more and more urgent. But it needs to be accompanied with social policies that improve the lives of people and also of farmers. Social justice cannot be an afterthought. It must be part of all efforts to address the climate and biodiversity crisis. So there's really no debate that the transition towards more sustainable agriculture and food system is needed, and we need to make these changes if we want to keep producing food in the future.
In the light of this election and the political changes taking place in the EU institutions, what are the priorities for Friends of the Earth in the coming 5 years?
We need to keep the focus on the real issues that farmers are facing. This includes fair incomes and decent working conditions, but also at the same time, we need to continue to push and accelerate a just transition towards more localized and resilient food and agricultural system. More concretely, this means a reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, so that it truly supports farmers, especially small and medium-scale farmers, to transition to more sustainable practices such as agroecology. There is a lot of money in the CAP, but 80% of the budget is currently going to the 20% biggest farms. And changing the way we produce food, for example, through reducing pesticide use, is possible and it's also urgent. And many farmers are already leading the way. But for these changes to happen, it also means securing fair incomes and working conditions so that farmers can take forward this transition.
Is there a role for other actors in the value chain to support farmers to implement the green transition?
Yeah, of course. Actors of the value chain also have a key role to play in the green transition. So this responsibility cannot be left to the farmers only. And this is why we need regulations and other public policies to ensure that this responsibility is shared throughout the value chain. In particular, it shouldn't be possible to buy and sell products below the cost of production. So actors in the supply chain, including supermarkets, have a role to play to ensure that farmers are remunerated fairly and that externalities, for example, on the environment, soil, water, etc., are properly accounted for. And we need proper regulations for this to happen. Voluntary measures will not be enough.
We've featured Matteo from Italy and the work he does to produce food and safeguard the environment. Do you see the next generation of farmers as an asset in the green transition?
Yes, I guess it could be. However, we also need to be aware of the current disappearance of farmers across Europe. So we're witnessing the numbers of farms plummet massively across the EU. Numbers show that between 2005 and 2020, the number of farms declined by about 37%, especially among the smallest farms. And there are, of course, young people who want to become farmers, but the current conditions are often not very enabling for them. And this is another reason why it is crucial to ensure that all farmers have access to decent income and good working conditions. And so legislation must be put in place at the EU level to regulate land and to give priority to new and young small and medium scale farmers.
Thanks to Clara Bourgin from Friends of the Earth. As promised, we're going back to Italy now to learn more from our 29-year-old farmer, Matteo Pagliarani, who's also a vice president of the European Council of Young Farmers. I asked him first about his priorities for agriculture in Europe and how he sees the Green Deal among those priorities.
The farmer's priority must be generational renewal. And if you work with the intention of leaving your land and your water in a better state than you found it, then you of course encourage generational change in farming. Agricultural policies must help with this too. It's why the idea of the Green Deal and an ecological transition must be of fundamental importance. And I would also like to stress social sustainability. If we lose people in rural areas, the farms will disappear too.
But what about the overall policy approach? We heard Matteo telling us that young farmers like him are very much the exception in Europe. This raises essential questions related to Europe's identity, its cohesion, and its autonomy in the world.
We need to talk more and more about agriculture. We increasingly need farmers, and in my case, young farmers, to be involved in the legislative process. And if we do not succeed in directly involving those in EU member states who are involved in agriculture and are professionals in agriculture, we will create a vision that I believe is strategically weak for farming. Because we need more professionalism and to ensure that these policies are forward-looking towards rural development. Because we are talking about rural development here. We're not just talking about business and economics.
But in pursuing rural development and ensuring adequate food production, what are the implications for the environment? Are we always destined to create a tension between the two? Can they be reconciled?
I've never known any farmer who is against the environment, against animals, biodiversity. Farmers are custodians of the land, custodians of biodiversity. This is absolutely fundamental. And therefore often I don't want to talk about how agriculture damages the environment. but rather about how one can complement the other, and even how the environment can be made stronger through farmers.
Finally, a few words from Matteo in the light of the European election as to what he wants to see from Europe, as a citizen, a farmer, a youngster, and as a representative of young citizen farmers.
I think we need to see a Europe that's more pragmatic and less bucolic. We need to invest to make ourselves more competitive in agriculture and the agri-food sector. To put agriculture at the centre of development policies, to put rural areas back at the heart of the public interest. I want a Europe that's united, liberal, that's able to respond to the crises we encounter, and that can make us ever more self-sufficient in what we need.
Thanks to Matteo Pagliarani in beautiful Emilia-Romagna for his insights into the downsides and the passions that are part of daily life for all farmers, but especially those with the onerous role of taking Europe's food production through the coming decades while helping us all make the transition to a more sustainable and greener world. And thanks to my other guests, Wolfgang Burtscher, the Director-General of the European Commission's DG Agri, and Clara Bourgin from Friends of the Earth. That's all from this edition of Food for Europe. As I've mentioned, you can hear all of our episodes on the DG Agri website and on all the major podcast platforms. We'll be back at the start of August with the perfect podcast for you to take on holiday. A visit to the iconic Libremont Agricultural Fair in Belgium. We look forward to your company then.
The entire agri-food sector bears the brunt of the climate crisis.
Pour parler d'agriculture et d'Europe à la jeunesse.
Proteste der Landwirte zeigen, wie wichtig der stratégische Dialog ist.
La PAC, c'est plus du tiers du budget total de l'Union européenne.
We have to find a new consensus on the future of agriculture.